Great. Okay, so thank you for everybody who submitted action plans. We've had quite a few in the last few days, and it's really good to see how people really want to take what they've learned and share it with their colleagues, and also to change some of the processes that you have in your supervisor to really look at actuarial aspects in a little bit more detail. So what we're going to do now is just have a quick reminder of what needs to be considered for your action plan. And then we have got quite a few problem statements and objectives that we'll have a look at, and how we can improve on some of those statements. And then finally, we'll just have a look at some of the steps in developing your action plan. So we don't have a lot of time, but I want to just give you some, take some time now to give you some input, so that if you want to make changes to your action plan between today and tomorrow, that you can make some changes, and you can get some more inputs on action plans tomorrow. So just a quick reminder is your action plan needs to cover a problem statement, the objectives, and the action plan steps. And I think that we thought about some questions yesterday to really help you think about the types, how to word your problem statements and how to word your objectives, and how to think about what would be practical to implement in your supervisor. And these were some of the questions that we thought of. So think to yourself, when you're looking at your problem statement and your objectives, or when you're writing them up this evening, why is this a problem? So here you can almost take a risk-based approach. Is this a very serious problem in your jurisdiction, or is it only a minor problem? And then have a look in terms of your objective of what you want to achieve. Is this going to make you a better supervisor? Is it going to help you to do your job better? Or maybe your colleagues to do their jobs better? And then another thing that's very important is there must be some sort of end to this action plan and to implementing this action plan. So how are you going to know when you've achieved those objectives? So they need to be specific enough for you to be able to know, okay, our supervisors achieved these objectives, now we can move on to something else. And then we need to be very careful that we're being realistic. So what can be achieved in maybe a 1-year time frame? And then our action plan steps, we need to break down all of the steps that we need to take to achieve these goals or achieve these objectives into very small steps. We need to be quite specific about who's going to be responsible. So we need to talk about maybe which department at the supervisor will be responsible. We need to be realistic about the time involved. So it can take a long time to collect data from industry or to analyze information. And we need to think about the availability of resources. So you all have other jobs that you are working on all the time. So what is realistic in terms of all of your other responsibilities at the supervisor? So these are quite small, but we have 7 examples of problem statements, and most of them have objectives. So I've labeled them 1 to 5. Most of these, the problem statements 1, there are 3 problem statements 1. They're all looking at areas of a lack of understanding of actuarial skills and a lack of being able to interpret actuarial reports or valuation reports. So ARVs are our actuarial valuation reports. So our first statement, if we look at the light green one, so the problem statement is that there's a lack of internal and interdepartmental training on actuarial concepts, and the objective is to ensure that there is training. So this this area recognizes, so here we really would want to understand, why is it a problem that we don't have training on actuarial concepts at the regulator? So here's where it would be good to ask that question of why is this a problem? And then the second question, the objective, is really around, and how will this make the team that you're working with perform their duties more effectively? So this is quite a broad statement, so it maybe can be refined a bit by thinking about some of the issues around why this is a problem and how this will and what needs to be addressed in terms of the challenges that you're facing. And the same with this objective, that this is also quite a broad objective, to talking about implementing training. Maybe we want to be a little bit more specific now that you've done the whole, you have finished the course virtually. Maybe there's some aspects that you really want to focus on in terms of those actuarial aspects. So I don't think it's necessary for everybody at the supervisor to maybe become actuaries. So we need to be able to focus very carefully on what aspects non-actuaries should be focusing on or learning more about in that area. So that was quite, so these questions just need a little bit of work in terms of where do you want to end up at the end of the approach. Then we had another question, two areas of the orange and the dark blue, is really framing the problem as not having the skills and the knowledge to analyze the actuarial valuation reports. And the dark blue one goes a step forward to say that they're missing having a more comprehensive analysis. So because we're lacking understanding, this is a challenge, and this is something that's missing in the assessment of the actuarial valuations. So here we've identified a key problem, and here maybe again we can think a little bit more further in terms of what are the consequences of not having that comprehensive analysis. So you don't necessarily need to put all of that detail in the problem statement, but for yourselves and your own notes, think about what these consequences might be. So maybe you don't pick up challenges where the reserves are too low early enough. Maybe you don't pick up challenges where the assumptions are inappropriate. So there's some implications to this lack of understanding that would be quite useful to understand. And those implications will help you to then set out your objectives. So if you think about what will go wrong because we don't have a good understanding of the actuarial reports, then that really can help you to set your objectives. So here is a helpful objective that looks at reviewing the reports as well as asking the right questions. So this is having a look at two aspects of the supervision process that you're going to look at. And maybe, again, now that you've done the course, maybe you can have a look at the different aspects of the report and then possibly identify which aspects of the report you would like to work on the most. And here again, it's really an objective to look at those actuarial reports. Craig, I don't know if you've got any comments on the problem statements that were all relating to understanding actuarial concepts and actuarial reports.
I just make, from an action planning point of view, I think the comment you made previously as well on the previous slide about, you know, knowing when you get to the completion of your action plan. Some of these problem statements are sort of a bit clearer to me than others. So if I just pick, for example, being able to ask the right questions, well, I mean, I think that's kind of a bit of an endless quest. Let's say, you know, if I could ask all the right questions all the time, that would be wonderful. So maybe when I get to the end of my my action plan, I want to be able to ask, you know, maybe some things that are, I think your suggestion, be a bit more focused is a good idea, to narrow down just, you know, what we want to do. Maybe we want to be able to ask some questions, because I know sometimes people have that challenge of, if I don't think I have all the right questions, I don't ask any. That's sort of another alternative. But giving it a little bit more focus like that could be good. Just, you know, what do you reasonably think you'll have at the end? And just while I have the microphone, so I'm not using too much time coming back to me again, I'll just make, I think a good example of this might be perhaps the number 2 on the intervention guideline being developed. See, I know when I get to the end of that project, because someone will be able to hold up the intervention guideline and say, look, here it is, you know, tick, done. So when you think about your objectives for the other ones, see if you can think about something where you can say, okay, it's going to be blindingly obvious when we get to the end of it that something will be there that wasn't there now, and let's describe what that is.
Thanks, Craig. Dunya?
Yeah, coming back to the endless quest of asking the right questions, could a template with multiple possible questions be part of the objective for this one? Just a thought.
Thanks, Dunya. So I think that both from Craig and Dunya's comments, you want something tangible at the end that you can measure. So you want to be able to either see that guideline, or see that template, or say I've had the following departments attend a training program that covers the following aspects, and so on. And yes, so I also agreed with Craig. So example 2 of the problem statements and the objective is much more concrete, and helps you also to define the steps that you're going to take for your action plan a lot more clearly, because at least you have the end goal. You know where you're starting, and it will help you much better to have a look at the steps. So here the problem was that there isn't a guideline on the intermediate interventions that need to be taken based on insurer's risk profile. And this is what Elias was talking about earlier, that you need to have that ladder of intervention to say, when this goes wrong, we're going to do this. If something more serious goes wrong, we're going to do something more serious. So here the objective is to develop that guideline. And then it has a goal of what you want to achieve and how it will make you a better supervisor in terms of being able to take prompt action when there are challenges. So here you can even see how this intervention is going to help you to do your job better. Okay, Elias.
Yeah, thanks. Maybe just to also weigh in, one of the things that I've learned over time, particularly working in a regulatory environment for the last 10 years, is that most of the time, when a regulator is faced with a situation that they need to make a decision, most of the time they are clouded with so many things that they could, or so many routes that they could take to maybe arrest a particular situation, or maybe to kind of direct a company to do some particular things, and that could take time. At the same way, you would find that a decision that is basically being made might not be the most effective. And again, if you take time and think through what types of decision you take, also makes your decision not be prompt and proactive. So I think it will be also interesting to see, based on the experience that different supervisors have, what would be the typical strategic or supervisory actions that they could list, and then from there, how would those actions and where would they basically kind of enforce those particular actions based on different scenarios that they have been facing. So I think it will be important also to see what typical actions and what stage would they really apply those particular actions, because there's always a delay on what actions our supervisor needs to take, not because those actions are not there, but because they are quite a variety, and you might even end up using a particular action that might not really be the best on its application to a particular case. So I think there's also need to maybe review different pieces of legislation, different regulations, and see which would fit with which types of cases, particularly on what we've gone through during this particular few weeks of study on issues of risk-based and other components.
Thanks, Elias. So I think for the country that's looking at the dark green objectives and problem statement, it will be good to think about the practicality of those guidelines. But please, so what Elias has been talking about a bit is what some of the forum questions are for the monitoring of solvency for risk-based supervision. So please, for the people who have contributed, thanks very much, but please have a look at other people's contributions. And if you haven't contributed yet, I think it's quite a nice database on different types of things that can go wrong and interventions that can be used. So then maybe just the last thing I'm going to say on this slide is for the light green, the purple and the turquoise, all of these questions came from the same action plan. So we really want to, these are all valid and useful and things that need to be addressed. I think it will be helpful to maybe pick which is the most important of these three areas and to work on that in a little bit more detail. Okay, Clinton.
Yeah, so what happened is in Ghana, we were advised that if we could come up with a single action plan. So we actually met last week to deliberate on the possible problem statement and the objectives. So how is this going to work? Or because I realized with the submission, it had to be individual.
So I think for Ghana, maybe you can chat to your colleagues and see which of the three problem statements and objectives you really want to work on, because it'll be easier if there's a team, a group of people at your supervisor who can work together to try and get some of these things implemented. It'll be quite difficult, I think, if you're working on your own. Will that make sense to you, Clinton? Yeah, so I think it'll be easier if you work together, and maybe you can save the other 2 points for a later time. And then just lastly, I wanted to just remind you, so we haven't talked about the steps in your action plan, but there's some common pitfalls that we've seen in previous action plans and in some of these action plans that have already been handed in. So maybe you can have a look at these as well. So sometimes we've talked quite a lot about this. It's unclear how these objectives will be achieved through the action plan steps. So we don't necessarily know how you're going to share the knowledge with your colleagues. So we need to be very precise and make sure that we are quite clear on how these steps will be achieved. Sometimes we're missing steps. So there's an example where one of the supervisors wants to have peer training, but you would need to identify which supervisors you would like to engage with first. And then sometimes there's some areas where there's more than one activity that's happening in the same step. So try and break down your action steps into small steps, and that you'll be able to then measure, have I achieved this step, can I go on to the next one? And then in terms of the timing, so sometimes our timing, I know everything seems urgent, so there are many places where the timing is as soon as possible, but sometimes that never happens. So maybe you want to say by the end of the year or within 3 months, something like that. And then there are other places where maybe the people who are, yes, and then be realistic. So, I mean, you're not necessarily going to be able to start the project next week because you need to do some planning ahead of time. So, so think about all of these areas. Sometimes the responsibilities are a little bit vague. So we just list things as it's the industry or the supervisor. We probably need to know which departments we're working with. Is it the life insurance market? Is the long-term insurance market? And then we need to consider all stakeholders. So most of the time we're just considering what the industry and the supervisor are doing, but think about, and this will help you to determine how this is going to make you a better supervisor. Think about what the impact to policyholders might be, or to your consumers, and then think about whether you will need to, which departments need to be engaged with, if you need to get external consultants to do training, and then maybe also who you can engage with to help you achieve your goals. So those are just a few tips on how to maybe improve on your action plans and make them more practical and more precise. It'll be great if you had a look at them again before Thursday, that's tomorrow. And there's a lot more time tomorrow to give input into the steps and the problem statements. So please have everything as almost final as it can be, so that you can get the most out of tomorrow's session. Dunya?
Yes, I just had a thought, particularly for those objectives where transfer of knowledge is highlighted, so some sort of transfer of knowledge, either from this training or future trainings. It will be also useful to think about sustainability, or, you know, institutionalizing that knowledge. I don't know, some ideas are perhaps creating a database of that knowledge, or I don't know, recordings of some type of certain trainings. So in whatever you do in that sense, just think about, you know, future colleagues, new colleagues who come in, and that they don't have to go through that not everyone has to go through the same thing, but that resources are made available within the institution.
Okay, so maybe there isn't really time for questions, but if maybe there's a couple, we can take a couple of minutes just for something that's worrying you, that you want to ask about before you work on your action plan for tomorrow.